The set was a mess, as always. Cameras, lights, and crew members were scattered everywhere, each lost in their own chaotic dance to keep the production afloat. I stood by the monitor, pretending to focus on the playback of the last take, but my eyes were fixed on Betty and Ethan, locked in a moment that was too real to be acting. Betty was pouring her heart out in the scene, and Ethan, the new lead, was matching her with a chemistry that made every camera lens sizzle. I watched as they exchanged lines that seemed to go beyond the script. Their bodies too close, the glances too intimate. For anyone else, it would have been a sign of a perfect performance. For me, it was the beginning of the end. "Cut," I called, my voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Betty flinched, breaking away from Ethan's gaze. She looked at me, but her eyes didn't meet mine. They were distant, like she was already somewhere else. Somewhere with him. "Great job, everyone," I said, forcing a smile that I hoped looked genuine. Take 5. I watched Betty walk over to the side, wiping the sweat from her brow, still caught in the intensity of the scene. Ethan followed her, a casual touch on her arm, something that might have seemed innocent to anyone else. But not to me, not when I knew the truth. I turned away, feeling the bile rise in my throat. I needed air. I made my way out of the studio, my mind racing back to the clues I'd been piecing together for weeks. The late-night rehearsals that never seemed to end, the whispered phone calls. The text messages she quickly swiped away when I entered the room. And now, the way she lit up around Ethan, a spark that had been missing between us for too long. I wasn't a fool. I'd seen this kind of thing happen before, with other actors, other directors. But this was different. This was my wife, the woman I'd built a life with. I leaned against the cold concrete wall outside the studio, trying to steady my breathing. Rage simmered under my skin, but more than that, it was the humiliation. The thought that everyone else might already know, that I was the last to see it. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos of us, Betty smiling at me on our wedding day, the two of us wrapped in each other's arms on a beach, our dreams so simple back then. I wondered when it had all started to fall apart, and how I hadn't noticed until it was too late. But as I looked at those pictures, the anger began to morph into something else, something sharper, colder. I knew confronting her wouldn't change anything. Betty was too good at pretending, too good at weaving lies that felt like truths. If I wanted to get even, I needed to hit where it would hurt the most. And that's when the idea hit me, a scene so devastating, so raw, that it would force her to confront everything she'd done. I wasn't going to just expose her. I was going to make her feel it. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the seed of revenge taking root in my mind. Betty thought she could rewrite the rules, but she was about to find out that no one plays me. Not on my set. Not in my life. The next morning, I was the first one on set, coffee in hand, staring at the script pages scattered across the table. Betty's betrayal was the only thing running through my mind, feeding my every decision. I'd spent the entire night rewriting the third act, sculpting it into something that would bleed truth. The kind of truth that would rip the veneer off her perfect little world. I tapped the pen against the table, staring at the new scene I'd written. One where Ethan's character shatters Betty's in a moment of gut-wrenching betrayal. The lines were vicious, honest, a brutal reflection of everything I'd seen between them. It wasn't just acting anymore. It was real. My assistant, Mark, walked in, a stack of papers under his arm. "You're in early," he said, setting the pile down. He glanced at the new pages and raised an eyebrow. "More changes?" "Yeah," I said, not looking up. "I want to dig deeper into their dynamic. Make it more intense." Mark nodded slowly, sensing something was off but knowing better than to ask. He'd been with me long enough to read the mood. "I'll get these printed for the cast." As Mark walked away, I took another sip of my coffee, my mind replaying every moment of that last take between Betty and Ethan. It wasn't just the way they looked at each other. It was the way Betty looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching. It was the guilt that flashed in her eyes, too quick to hide. Ethan arrived next, looking fresh and confident, like he hadn't a care in the world. He greeted the crew, flashing that easy smile that had charmed everyone on set. Everyone except me. I couldn't stand the sight of him, not now. I watched as Betty arrived, her expression guarded. She walked over to me, her smile tentative. "Morning," she said, her voice soft, testing the waters. "Morning," I replied, my tone clipped. I handed her the new pages. "We're going in a different direction with the next scene. More raw. I think it'll really push your character." Betty flipped through the script, her eyes scanning the words. I saw the exact moment she realized what I'd done, her face paling. She glanced up at me, and for a second, I saw the flicker of fear. She knew. I didn't expect this change, she stammered, struggling to maintain her composure. Neither did I said coldly. But sometimes, things need to change. I walked away before she could respond, leaving her with the weight of what was to come. I knew Betty would never admit to the affair, not outright. But on that set, under those lights, she wouldn't be able to hide from what she'd done. And I'd be there, behind the camera, capturing every moment of her unraveling. It wasn't just a scene anymore. It was my revenge. The set was silent, the kind of silence that buzzed with anticipation. The crew was in place, cameras ready, lights focused on the small, intimate space where Betty and Ethan were about to face each other. It was a simple setup, a bedroom scene, just the two of them. But this time, the stakes were different. This wasn't just another take, it was a reckoning. I sat in my director's chair, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me. I'd spent hours briefing the crew, instructing them to capture every tear, every tremble. I needed it perfect. I needed it real. Betty and Ethan stood under the lights, waiting for my call, but there was no friendly banter between them today. The mood was tense and strained, and I could see the cracks starting to form. All right, everyone, let's get this right in one go. I said, my voice echoing through the set. I want every emotion on display. No holding back. Betty glanced at me, her eyes searching mine for something. Approval, reassurance, maybe even a hint of the man she used to know. But all she got was cold detachment. She looked away, her confidence visibly shaken. Action, I called. Ethan began his lines, delivering them with that effortless charm that had made him the rising star everyone couldn't stop talking about. But today, his voice had an edge. A nervous energy that wasn't there before. He reached out to touch Betty, but his hand hovered for a moment, hesitant, like he was afraid to follow through. Betty was different. She was tense, her movements stiff, her usual poise replaced with something raw and unpolished. She threw herself into the role, but the lines hit too close to home. Each word seemed to cut deeper, each gesture more desperate. She was slipping, and I could see it. The scene builds to the climax, the moment where Ethan's character betrays her, confessing to infidelities that mirror their own. Betty's face crumpled as Ethan delivered the lines, his voice dripping with the kind of cruelty that felt too real to be acting. She flinched, her breath catching, and for a split second, it wasn't just her character breaking, it was Betty. Tears streamed down her face, and she tried to stay in character, but the emotions overwhelmed her. Her sobs were no longer part of the script. She was unraveling right in front of everyone, and there was no way to hide it. I kept the cameras rolling, capturing every second of her collapse. Ethan's composure faltered as well. He looked over at me, confusion and guilt etched on his face. He was supposed to be the confident lead, but now he was just a man caught in a web of lies that were no longer easy to deny. Cut, I said softly, but the word hung in the air like a final verdict. Betty sank to the floor, her body trembling. She didn't look at Ethan. She didn't look at me. She was lost in her own guilt and shame. Exposed under the harsh lights that she had once thrived in. There was a heavy silence before the crew started moving again, whispering among themselves. No one knew what to say. I stood up, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was what I had wanted, a raw, undeniable truth laid bare for all to see. Betty had nowhere to run, and Ethan's smug confidence had shattered. They were trapped in the scene I'd created, forced to live out the consequences of their own actions. I walked over to Betty, who was still on the floor, her face streaked with mascara and tears. I offered her a hand, but she hesitated before taking it. There was no warmth in my touch, no comfort in my grip. Just a silent acknowledgement that this was far from over. Take 5, I said to the crew, pulling Betty to her feet. She stumbled slightly, avoiding my eyes. Ethan hovered nearby, looking lost, his usual swagger gone. We'll do it again if we have to, I told them, my tone flat. But next time, I want it perfect. Betty nodded weakly, but her spirit was broken. She knew this scene wasn't just another day on set. It was my revenge, and she was powerless to stop it. The editing room was my sanctuary. I spent every waking hour in there, going through the footage frame by frame, piecing together the story I wanted to tell. The betrayal scene was a masterpiece of pain, every shot capturing the raw, unfiltered agony of the moment. I made sure to emphasize Betty's vulnerability, her tears magnified on the big screen. And her breakdown stretched just a little longer than necessary. Every cut was deliberate, every angle chosen to amplify the heartbreak. Mark hovered behind me, watching as I worked. He knew better than to interrupt, but even he couldn't ignore the darkness in the footage. "This is intense," he finally said, his voice low. "Are you sure it fits the tone of the rest of the film?" "It's the heart of the film," I replied, not taking my eyes off the screen. "It's what the whole story has been building towards." Mark didn't argue. He just nodded and backed away, leaving me alone with my work. I layered in the music next, haunting, dissonant, amplifying the tension that simmered beneath the surface. I wanted the audience to feel every ounce of the betrayal, to be pulled into the emotional carnage that Betty and Ethan had created. As I watched the final cut, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of triumph. This was my story now, not theirs. Every second was a reminder of what they'd done. And I couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces when it played out in front of an audience. Premiere night loomed closer, and with every passing day, Betty grew more distant. She avoided me at home, her once cheerful demeanor replaced by a quiet, nervous tension. She knew something was coming, but she couldn't quite figure out what. And that was just the way I wanted it. The day before the premiere, I called a meeting with the cast and crew. Everyone was buzzing with excitement, anticipating the film's release. I watched as Betty and Ethan walked in, sitting as far from each other as possible, their connection frayed by the weight of what had happened on set. "Tomorrow's the big night," I began, my tone light but firm. "I just want to say thank you to everyone for your hard work. This film is something special, and it wouldn't have been possible without all of you." I made eye contact with Betty, holding her gaze just long enough to see the flicker of fear behind her eyes. I smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was a promise that the real show was just about to begin. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the undercurrent of tension that everyone else seemed oblivious to. Betty looked down, fiddling with the hem of her dress, lost in her own thoughts. "See you all at the premiere," I finished, dismissing the group. "It's going to be a night to remember." As they filed out, I stayed back, letting the room empty until it was just me and the echoes of my own plans. The stage was set. The final act was written, and tomorrow, when the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, Betty and Ethan would finally face the truth they'd tried so hard to hide. But this time, it would be in front of everyone. The theater was packed. The red carpet outside was buzzing with photographers, reporters, and the usual crowd of onlookers hoping to catch a glimpse of Hollywood glamour. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. This was the night everyone had been waiting for, the big reveal of my latest film. A thriller that promised to be my most daring work yet. I stood by the entrance, shaking hands with familiar faces, industry insiders, and friends who had come to support me. Betty arrived late, fashionably so, her stunning dress doing little to hide the unease that clung to her like a shadow. Ethan was right behind her, his confidence noticeably diminished since we wrapped filming. They exchanged stiff greetings with the guests, both avoiding eye contact with me. Oliver, the genius director, a critic I recognized, called out as he approached me. "The buzz is incredible. Everyone's talking about the final scene. I've heard it's quite something." I forced a smile. "It's all about pushing boundaries," I replied, glancing briefly at Betty. "I think tonight will surprise a lot of people." The lights flickered, signaling that the screening was about to begin. I took my seat in the front row, deliberately positioned so that I could keep an eye on Betty and Ethan. They sat a few rows behind me, separated by just enough space to make their discomfort obvious. I leaned back, the anticipation coursing through my veins as the opening credits rolled. The audience was drawn in from the start. The film's pace was tight, the performances gripping, but I knew that all of it was just the build-up to the moment I'd been waiting for. I glanced at the screen as Betty appeared, her face illuminated in the darkness. She looked beautiful and strong, but there was an underlying fragility in her eyes that I knew wasn't just acting. The pivotal scene finally began. The audience leaned forward, the tension palpable. Betty and Ethan's characters were in a heated argument, the dialogue sharp, cutting like a knife. I could feel the room holding its breath as Ethan delivered the lines that would shatter everything. His betrayal played out brutally on screen, his character admitting to lies, infidelity, and deceit, all crafted to mirror their real-life affair. Betty's performance was gut-wrenching. She was breaking down, her sobs echoing through the theater as she stumbled through the scene. The audience was transfixed, moved by the rawness of the moment, but for me, it was a different kind of satisfaction. I watched Betty's face closely and saw the flicker of realization, the moment she truly understood that this wasn't just a role. This was her punishment. I turned slightly in my seat to catch a glimpse of her reaction. Betty was pale, gripping the armrests as if they were the only things keeping her grounded. Ethan's expression was equally strained, the weight of their secret heavy on his shoulders. As the scene ended, the theater erupted in stunned silence, followed by hesitant applause. The emotional impact had hit everyone, just as I planned. But for Betty and Ethan, it was more than a performance. It was a public reckoning, their private betrayal laid bare for all to see. The credits rolled, and I rose to address the audience. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice calm, almost detached. "This film is about more than just a story, it's about truth, pain, and the consequences of our actions." I paused, letting the words sink in. Betty stared at me, her eyes glistening with tears she couldn't hold back. Ethan looked down, his bravado completely stripped away. I felt no sympathy, no regret. They had chosen their path, and now they were forced to walk it. I stepped off the stage, leaving Betty and Ethan to face the murmurs of the crowd. People were whispering, piecing together the connections, the eerie parallels between the characters and the actors who portrayed them. Betty tried to slip away, but there was no escaping the spotlight tonight. She had nowhere to hide, no script to shield her from the truth. The after-party was a blur of clinking glasses, congratulatory pats on the back, and hushed conversations dissecting the film's explosive ending. I made my way through the room, accepting praise with a forced smile, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept catching glimpses of Betty in the crowd, her composure slipping as the night wore on. She looked like a cornered animal, trapped by the very fame she'd once reveled in. I found her by the bar, nursing a drink she hadn't touched. Ethan was nearby, talking with a producer, but his eyes kept darting to Betty. They were both unraveling in slow motion, and I couldn't help but savor every second. Betty turned as I approached, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "Was this your plan all along?" she asked, her voice low but trembling with fury. "To humiliate me? To turn my life into some kind of sick spectacle?" I met her gaze, unflinching. "I told you this was a story about betrayal," I said calmly. "You just didn't realize you were living it." Betty's eyes welled up, and she looked away, her breath hitching. I could see the shame eating away at her, the realization that she'd been exposed in front of everyone she knew. The glamorous actress, the starlet who could do no wrong, was now just another scandal waiting to be dissected by the tabloids. Ethan joined us, his expression dark. "You went too far, Oliver," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This wasn't just a film, it was personal. You've crossed a line." I shrugged, unbothered by his indignation. Maybe I did, but lines were crossed long before I picked up that camera. Betty put her glass down, her hands shaking. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know how to stop. I stared at her, feeling nothing but a hollow emptiness. "You could have stopped any time you wanted," I replied, my tone flat. "But you didn't. And now, here we are." The conversation ended there, with Betty unable to find the words to justify herself and Ethan seething but powerless. I walked away, leaving them to drown in the mess they'd created. The party continued around them, but Betty and Ethan were isolated, alone in a sea of people who had witnessed their downfall. I stepped outside, away from the noise and the forced smiles. The night was cool, the city lights blinking against the dark sky. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the messages of congratulations, the praise for a film that had struck a nerve. But none of it mattered. I had gotten my revenge, but it hadn't filled the void that Betty's betrayal had carved into me. I looked back at the theater, the place where I'd laid everything bare. Betty and Ethan would have to live with what they'd done, just as I would. But tonight, I'd reclaimed the narrative. They were no longer the stars of this story, I was. And as the director of this twisted finale, I'd made sure that every frame, every line, was my own. The night was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't happiness, not really. But it was enough. Days passed, but the impact of the premiere lingered like a bad aftertaste. Reviews poured in, praising the film's raw intensity and bold storytelling. The betrayal scene was hailed as a career-defining moment, not just for me, but also for Betty and Ethan. Critics couldn't stop talking about how real their performances felt, not knowing they were witnessing a genuine collapse, not just great acting. But behind the glowing headlines, the reality was much darker. Betty avoided the spotlight, declining interviews and skipping out on promotional appearances. Her usually active social media went silent. I knew she was hiding, overwhelmed by the public exposure of her affair. Ethan, too, had gone quiet, retreating from the press and refusing to comment on the rumors swirling around him. For once, he was out of charming one-liners. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in our empty house, the silence heavy and oppressive. Betty's things were still scattered everywhere, her clothes draped over the armchair, her half-read books piled on the coffee table. But she was nowhere to be found. She'd been staying at a hotel since the premiere, a self-imposed exile that suited me just fine. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Mark, my editor and one of the few people who knew the full story behind the film. "You've seen the latest, right?" he asked without preamble. I sighed, already knowing what he was talking about. "What now?" "Ethan's PR team is trying to spin it, saying the scene was a creative collaboration, and that the emotional breakdown was part of the script." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course they are. Let him pretend. We all know the truth." Mark hesitated before continuing. "And Betty? How's she handling all this?" I stared at the ceiling, tracing the lines of a crack that had formed after a storm last year. "She's not handling it at all. But that's not my problem anymore." Mark paused, the silence on the other end stretching uncomfortably. "You sure about that, Oliver? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like everyone's still stuck in the same mess." I hung up, tossing the phone aside. I didn't need Mark's pity or his attempts at playing the moral compass. I'd done what I needed to do, and now it was time to move on. But no matter how hard I tried to shut it out, the fallout kept creeping in. Betty finally called later that evening. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Oliver, we need to talk." "About what?" I asked, keeping my tone flat. I wasn't in the mood for apologies or excuses. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to make this right." I could hear the sincerity in her voice, the pain that was eating away at her. But it didn't matter anymore. "You can't make it right, Betty. You just have to live with it." "We both do." There was a long pause, and I could hear her struggling to find the words. "I want to come home." I closed my eyes, the exhaustion finally catching up to me. Part of me wanted to let her back in, to rebuild something from the ashes. But the other part, the part that had been burned by her betrayal, couldn't let go. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Not now." Betty didn't argue. She just whispered a soft, "Okay," before hanging up. I stared at the phone, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. I'd gotten what I wanted, but the victory was hollow. There was no going back to the way things were. The damage was done. The days turned into weeks, and life slowly began to move forward, but it was like trying to walk through quicksand. I threw myself into my work, signing on for a new project that promised to keep me busy for the next year. It was a distraction, but it was better than drowning in my own thoughts. Betty stayed away, and for the first time in years, our home was truly mine. I redecorated the living room, packed away the remnants of our shared life, and tried to find solace in the solitude. Friends reached out, offering support, but I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to explain, to relive everything that had happened. One morning, as I sat at my desk reviewing scripts, I received a letter from Betty. Not a text or an email, a real letter, handwritten on thick, expensive stationery. I hesitated before opening it, half expecting another apology. But this time, it was different. She wrote about how the premiere had been her breaking point, how she'd realized the extent of what she'd lost, not just me, but the version of herself she'd once been proud of. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, she detailed how she was leaving Los Angeles for a while, heading to a quiet retreat up north to find herself again. "I need to understand why I did what I did," she wrote. "And I need to do it alone." There was a finality in her words, a sense of closure that felt different from our previous conversations. For the first time, Betty was acknowledging that we couldn't just patch things up and pretend nothing had happened. She needed space, and maybe I did, too. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside, feeling an unexpected lightness. Betty's departure felt like the end of an era, one that had been filled with both incredible highs and devastating lows. It wasn't the ending I'd envisioned, but it was an ending nonetheless. Later that afternoon, I met Mark at a small cafe downtown. We hadn't seen each other since the premiere, and he was eager to catch up. "How's everything going?" he asked, eyeing me carefully. I shrugged. "It's going. Betty's leaving town for a bit." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe it's for the best. Time apart can be good." I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. "Yeah, it's time for something new." Mark smiled, raising his cup in a small toast. "To new beginnings, then." We clinked our cups together, the sound sharp and clear. As I looked out at the busy street, I felt a strange sense of peace. Betty was gone, Ethan was a fading memory, and for the first time in a long while, my future was mine to shape. I had no idea what came next, but for the first time, I was okay with that. With Betty gone, the house felt emptier than ever. It wasn't just her absence that weighed on me, it was the silence that filled every corner. I'd grown accustomed to the noise, the hum of her voice, the faint music playing in the background, the rustling of pages as she read late into the night. Now, all that was left were memories that refused to fade. Work was my only escape. I poured myself into the new project, determined to create something that would pull me out of the shadow of my last film. The script was solid, a psychological thriller that had all the makings of a box office hit. But every time I sat down to write or storyboard, my thoughts drifted back to Betty, to the finality of our last conversation. One evening, as I stared at my laptop screen, unable to focus, I decided to take a drive. It was something I used to do when I was younger, get lost in the city, and let the winding roads and flickering lights guide me somewhere new. Tonight, I needed that distraction. I ended up at a small beach, the kind of secluded spot where the waves drowned out everything else. I parked the car and walked down to the shoreline, the cool sand shifting under my feet. The sky was a deep blue, almost black, with stars scattered like broken glass. I stood there for a while, watching the waves crash against the rocks, feeling the chill of the ocean breeze on my skin. I pulled out my phone and, on impulse, dialed Betty's number. I wasn't sure if she'd pick up, and part of me hoped she wouldn't. But after a few rings, she answered, her voice soft and distant. "Oliver," she said, and I could hear the surprise in her tone. "It's late. Is everything okay?" I didn't have an answer. I stared out at the water, the words catching in my throat. I was thinking about everything. Betty was quiet, waiting. I could picture her sitting in some quiet cabin, far from the chaos of LA, her face illuminated by the glow of a single lamp. "I've been thinking a lot too," she finally said. "About what we had, what we lost." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "I thought punishing you would make me feel better. That exposing everything would give me some kind of closure. But it didn't. Not really." There was a pause, and when Betty spoke again, her voice was softer, almost fragile. "I never wanted to hurt you, Oliver. I lost myself along the way, and I'm still trying to figure out why." I let her words sink in, the truth of them cutting deeper than I'd expected. "I don't know what's next for us," I said honestly. "But I think we need to let go of what we were. Holding onto it, it's just tearing us apart." Betty sighed, and I could hear the weight of her own regrets. "Maybe one day, we'll be able to look back and remember the good parts without all the pain. But for now, you're right, we need to let go." The conversation ended quietly, without the dramatic flair of our previous fights. It was just two people trying to find their way out of the wreckage. I hung up and stood there a while longer, watching the tide pull in and out, erasing my footprints in the sand. For the first time, I felt the beginnings of something new, hope, maybe. Or at least, the faintest flicker of it. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of progress and setbacks. I threw myself back into work with renewed focus, determined to move forward. The new film was shaping up nicely, and the creative process was starting to feel less like a chore and more like the passion it used to be. But every now and then, the past crept back in, and I'd find myself staring at old photos or replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. One afternoon, as I was leaving the set, I ran into Ethan. It was the first time I'd seen him since the premiere. He looked rough, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. He wasn't the confident actor who'd once captivated Betty, He was just another man trying to pick up the pieces. "Oliver," he said, catching up to me. "Can we talk?" I didn't have the energy for another confrontation, but there was something different in his demeanor, an absence of the arrogance that had always grated on me. I nodded, and we found a quiet corner away from the bustling crew. "I'm not here to make excuses," Ethan began, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I messed up. I hurt people I cared about, and I've been paying for it every day since." I watched him, waiting for the self-pity, but it didn't come. He was just tired. "We all made mistakes," I said, not offering him any solace but not attacking him either. "But it's over now." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "I've been thinking about leaving LA. Maybe going back to the theater, where I started. I need a reset." "Sounds like a good idea," I replied, genuinely. "We all need a reset." Ethan glanced at me, and for a moment, there was a flicker of the man I'd once begrudgingly admired. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry, Oliver. Not just for Betty, but for everything. You're a better man than I gave you credit for." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not really, but it was something. We parted ways without the weight of our past dragging us down, just two people trying to move on in their own way. That night, I returned home to the quiet house. I put on one of my old favorite records. Something I hadn't done in years. The music filled the space, soft and melancholic, but comforting in its familiarity. I sat on the couch, letting the sound wash over me, feeling the tension in my chest slowly begin to ease. I wasn't sure where Betty was now, or what Ethan's next move would be, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel tethered to their choices. The anger, the betrayal, the desire for revenge, they were all still there, but muted, like a distant echo. I thought about the future, new projects, new possibilities, and maybe, someday, new connections. But for now, it was enough just to sit here, alone but not lonely, and let the past finally start to fade. I'd been so consumed by the need to hurt back, to reclaim what I'd lost, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just be. The record spun on, and I leaned back, closing my eyes. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I was okay with that. I was healing, slowly but surely, in my own way. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A month passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. It was strange, waking up each day without the weight of betrayal looming over me. The emptiness that had once filled the house was slowly replaced with something more manageable. I wasn't happy, not yet, but I wasn't drowning anymore. I'd started seeing an old friend, Jessica, who worked as a producer on one of my earlier films. She wasn't just a distraction, she was a reminder that connections could be honest, uncomplicated, and devoid of the chaos that had consumed my relationship with Betty. We met for coffee regularly, and sometimes we'd take long walks through the quieter parts of the city, talking about anything but the past. Jessica had a way of cutting through the noise, of making me see things for what they were without any sugarcoating. She was direct, and unafraid to challenge me when I fell into old patterns of self-pity. One afternoon, we were sitting on a bench overlooking the reservoir, the city skyline glimmering in the distance. Jessica sipped her coffee and turned to me with a familiar look of concern. "You've been different lately," she said, studying me closely. "Better, I think, but still holding back." I shrugged, kicking a loose pebble off the edge of the path. "I'm trying to move on. It's just hard to shake everything, you know?" Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "You don't have to have it all figured out. But you have to let yourself feel something other than guilt or anger." I leaned back, staring at the water. I've been so caught up in what happened with Betty and Ethan. It's like I've forgotten how to just be. Jessica reached out, placing a hand on mine. "You're not defined by that. You're allowed to rebuild, Oliver. It's not a betrayal to want something good for yourself." Her words hung in the air, resonating more than I expected. I realized I'd been clinging to my pain as a form of penance, as if letting go would mean absolving Betty or even myself. But maybe it was time to give myself permission to move on. Jessica smiled, squeezing my hand before pulling back. "You don't have to rush it. Just take it one day at a time." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the water. For the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope that things could get better. It wasn't a grand epiphany, just a quiet understanding that I could start again, even if it was just one small step at a time. The next few weeks were filled with small but significant changes. I focused on finishing the new film, putting all my energy into crafting something that felt genuine and real. The creative process became a kind of therapy, allowing me to channel my thoughts into something productive. Jessica became a steady presence, and while we never defined what we were, her support was enough. It was refreshing to be around someone who didn't push for answers or expect more than I could give. One evening, I received an unexpected email from Betty. She was still up north, but she sounded lighter, more at peace. She wrote about the quietness of her retreat, the long walks she took every morning, and the art classes she'd started attending. It was as if she were rediscovering herself, piece by piece, away from the noise of our old lives. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she wrote, "but I am learning to forgive myself. I hope you can do the same, even if it's just for your own peace." There was no request to meet, no plea for reconciliation, just a simple acknowledgement of the past and a hope for the future. I read her words over and over, feeling a strange sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Betty was doing what she needed to do, and for the first time, I realized that was enough. I didn't need to keep punishing her or myself for what had happened. We were both trying to move on, in our own ways. I closed the email, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It was time to start living again, not out of spite or as a means to prove something, but because life was too short to be stuck in the past. That night, I went to Jessica's and we cooked dinner together, laughing as we fumbled through a new recipe. It was a simple, quiet night, but it was exactly what I needed. As we sat down to eat, Jessica looked at me, her eyes soft and sincere. "You look lighter," she said, smiling. "Like you're finally letting go." I smiled back, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah, I think I am. And it feels good." Jessica raised her glass, and we toasted to new beginnings, not the kind marked by grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but the slow, steady kind that comes from simply choosing to move forward. We were still figuring things out, still navigating the messiness of our own lives, but we were doing it together, and that was enough. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about all that had happened, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the desperate need for revenge that had consumed me for so long. It was still there, lingering at the edges of my mind, but it no longer defined me. I was more than just the sum of my mistakes, more than the pain I'd endured. I was moving forward, one day at a time, and for the first time, that felt like more than enough. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet settle around me. I didn't know what the future held, but whatever it was, I was ready to face it on my own terms. The past was behind me, and in its place, there was something new, something worth holding on to. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that, whatever happened next, I would be okay. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself less burdened by thoughts of Betty and Ethan. My focus shifted back to the film industry, and with Jessica by my side, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. We worked together on a small indie project, nothing grandiose but deeply fulfilling. A story that captured the quiet resilience of ordinary people, much like what I was experiencing in my own life. The film was nearing completion when I received an invitation to a director's panel in New York. It was a prestigious event, a chance to showcase my work alongside some of the industry's best. But as I read through the lineup, my heart sank. Betty was listed as one of the guest speakers. She'd been invited to discuss her recent art exhibitions, which had gained attention for their raw, personal themes of loss and recovery. Jessica noticed the change in my expression. "You okay?" she asked, leaning over to glance at the email. I nodded, swallowing the surge of anxiety. "Yeah, it's just, Betty's going to be there." Jessica's brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded in understanding. "You don't have to go, you know. You've done a lot to move on, and seeing her might set you back." But deep down, I knew this was something I needed to face. Avoiding Betty forever wasn't realistic, and this panel was an important opportunity for my career. I couldn't keep running from the remnants of our past. "No," I said firmly. "I need to do this." The night of the panel arrived faster than I expected. The venue was packed with familiar faces, directors, producers, actors, critics, all buzzing with excitement. As I walked through the crowd, I spotted Betty on the other side of the room, talking to a small group of people. She looked different, more composed, softer, like she had finally found some semblance of peace. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, the noise of the crowd faded. There was no animosity, no lingering resentment. Just a quiet acknowledgement of everything we'd been through. She gave me a small, tentative smile, and I returned it, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite define. The panel itself went well. I spoke about my latest work, the creative process, and the importance of storytelling as a means of healing. When it was Betty's turn, she spoke eloquently about her art, about how painting had helped her navigate through the darkness of our shared past. There were no digs, no veiled references to our personal lives. Just a woman speaking her truth. After the panel, Betty approached me as the crowd began to disperse. "You did well," she said, her tone sincere. "I'm glad to see you're doing okay." "Thanks," I replied, managing a genuine smile. "You too. Your work it's really powerful." We stood there, neither of us quite knowing what to say. There was no need for apologies or rehashing old wounds, we'd both moved past that. Finally, Betty extended her hand. "Take care of yourself, Oliver." I shook her hand, feeling the finality of the gesture. "You too, Betty." As I watched her walk away, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. We'd both made mistakes, and we'd both paid the price. But we were here, still standing, still moving forward. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and that was enough. The next morning, Jessica and I decided to explore the city before catching our flight back to LA. We wandered through Central Park, the crisp autumn air filling our lungs as we strolled beneath the vibrant canopy of red and gold leaves. It was a perfect day, simple, unburdened by the weight of expectations. Jessica looped her arm through mine, leaning her head against my shoulder as we walked. "Last night was a lot," she said, her voice soft. "But you handled it well." I nodded, still processing everything that had happened. It was strange, seeing Betty like that. But I think it was good. We needed that moment. Jessica looked up at me, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "You've come a long way, Oliver. You've been through hell, but you didn't let it destroy you. That's something to be proud of." We stopped at a small cafe, grabbing coffee and sitting by the window where we could watch the world pass by. As I looked out at the bustling city, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living, fully present in each moment. Jessica reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "So, what's next? Back to the grind?" I smiled, thinking about the projects waiting for me back in LA. "The story's still left to tell." "Yeah, but maybe with a little more balance this time. No more losing myself in the work." She grinned, squeezing my hand. "Good, you deserve that." We spent the rest of the day exploring, savoring every minute before heading back to the airport. On the flight home, I stared out the window, watching the city fade beneath us. I thought about the journey I'd been on, the heartbreak, the anger, the desperate need for revenge that had nearly consumed me. But now, all of that felt distant, like a story from another life. When we landed in LA, Jessica and I stepped out into the warm evening air. I looked at her, feeling grateful for her presence, for the way she'd helped me see that life could be good again, even after everything. "You hungry?" she asked, looping her arm through mine as we made our way to the car. "Starving," I admitted, laughing. "Let's grab something on the way home." We drove with the windows down, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color. As we pulled into a diner, I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to what came next. There were no grand plans, no elaborate schemes, just the promise of something new, something real. Sitting across from Jessica, sharing a meal and laughing over nothing in particular, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. I didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. I was finally free of the past, ready to embrace whatever the future had in store. And that, in itself, was a victory. A few months had passed, and life settled into a quiet, satisfying rhythm. Jessica and I continued to work together, finding joy in our shared projects and the simplicity of our growing relationship. There was no pressure to define what we were, no rush to put labels on something that was evolving naturally. We were just happy, and that was enough. One crisp morning, I stood at the window of my new office, watching the early sunlight filter through the cityscape. It was a modest space compared to what I'd had before, but it felt right, more personal, more me. I was working on another film, a small indie project that had captured my heart from the first draft. It wasn't about betrayal or revenge, it was about healing, about finding your way back after losing yourself. Jessica walked in, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and set one down on my desk. "I know you've had at least 3 already, but I figured what's one more?" she joked, sitting on the edge of the desk and taking a sip from her own cup. I smiled, grateful for her effortless presence. Thanks. I need all the caffeine I can get. She glanced at the storyboard on the wall, studying the sketches and notes I'd pinned up. This one's different, she said thoughtfully. It feels hopeful. I nodded, appreciating her insight. Yeah, it's personal. I think it's the first time I've really felt like I'm telling my own story, even if it's not directly about me. Jessica looked at me with that same supportive gaze I'd grown so accustomed to. You've come a long way, Oliver. I'm proud of you. I reached out, taking her hand. Couldn't have done it without you. We spent the rest of the morning working side by side, the silence between us comfortable and companionable. Every once in a while, Jessica would offer a suggestion or a critique, and I found myself welcoming her input. It was like we were building something together, not just professionally, but personally as well. Later that afternoon, I received a call from my agent. He told me that the indie film we'd wrapped up earlier in the year had been accepted into a major film festival. It wasn't the most prestigious one, but it was a significant step forward, a chance to show the world that I was still here, still creating. We did it, I said to Jessica, a grin spreading across my face as I hung up the phone. Jessica laughed, pulling me into a tight hug. Of course we did. You've been putting in the work. You deserve this. As the news sank in, I realized that this moment was about more than just the success of a film. It was a testament to everything I'd been through, a symbol of resilience, and the quiet determination to keep going even when things fell apart. I wasn't just bouncing back, I was building something new, something better. The festival arrived quickly, and as I stood at the premiere, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and Jessica, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. There were no lingering fears, no regrets, just a deep appreciation for how far I'd come. Betty wasn't there, and I was fine with that. I had made peace with her absence, understanding that our paths had diverged, and that was okay. We were both where we needed to be. I knew she was doing well from occasional mutual acquaintances, and it was enough to know that she, too, was moving forward. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. As the first scenes of the film played out, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, for the mistakes, the heartache, the long road to forgiveness, and the people who had helped me along the way. Jessica leaned over, whispering in my ear, "Proud of you, Oliver. You've really done it." I squeezed her hand, not needing to say anything in response. She knew. She'd been there every step of the way, through the highs and lows, through the moments of doubt and the quiet victories. And now, here we were, on the other side of it all. When the film ended, the audience erupted in applause. I stood up, feeling a rush of emotion that I hadn't expected. This was more than just a professional achievement. It was a personal triumph, a reminder that I could rebuild, that I could find joy again. As we left the theater, Jessica and I stepped out into the cool night air. The city buzzed with life around us, and I felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. We walked, hand in hand, the streetlights casting a warm glow on the pavement ahead. Ready for whatever comes next? Jessica asked, smiling up at me. I looked at her, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Yeah, I am. And whatever it is, I know we'll face it together. We continued down the street, two people who had found their way out of the darkness, embracing a new beginning. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was all I could ever ask for. As we disappeared into the night, I knew that this was just the start of something beautiful. A story of resilience, of letting go, and of finding love in the most unexpected places. The past was behind us, and the future was ours to create, one day at a time.